This week I want to talk about the contribution of women. And the word contribution has been a word carefully chosen because it covers a wide area. Indeed, there will be a number of digressions in these slides because there is not actually that much that we can say about the contribution of women because, as I said at the beginning, there is a shortage of material. We know the dates of battles, we know when cities were taken, we know when they were lost, we know when they were retaken. We know when various European kings and other potentates would turn up in the Holy Land, but about what was going on in the Holy Land or the Crusader kingdoms or states is something that is very much a matter of guesswork and extrapolation from conditions in Western Europe. It is very difficult to write a social history of life in the Crusader kingdoms because most of the information has disappeared. But I'll do what I can in the time available. The cover image has nothing whatever to do with the Crusades. This is from the Siege of Beauvais in France in 1472, when I believe the Duke of Burgundy was at war with the King of France. But I chose this image because it's striking. You've got the siege ladders placed against the walls of a city. You have a soldier who's climbed up to the top of it, and you can see that he's being repelled by a mixed force of men and women. You can see the male soldiers in their helmets with their armour and their spears and their bows and arrows, but very prominently on the walls you have two women. One of them is throwing rocks down onto the attackers, and this woman, she has an axe in her hand and she is fighting this man off. She's knocked him off the ladder and he'll fall down and break his back, and that'll be the end of him. And she is setting about the attackers with an axe. As I said, this has nothing to do with the Crusades, but it's an interesting way into the subject. And because the Crusader kingdoms were in some degree at war or on the edge of war throughout their entire existence, even though for long periods there was de facto peace and a fairly regular interaction between the various peoples, it is, when talking about women, useful to consider to what extent they took part in the fighting. The evidence is that just as in Western Europe, so in the Crusader kingdoms, women took a much more prominent role in the fighting than we might, on first inspection, assume to be the case. That, I suppose, is our image of women in the Middle Ages. On the left, you have a woman sitting at a loom. She's spinning, and she's sitting there, and that is women's work. It's relatively immobile. It is not physically taxing, though sitting there for hour after hour doing that might wear me out. But it is, as I said, women's work. It is something rather placid, something rather immobile, something that does not involve very much in the way of decision making. Or we can look at this lady on the right from the higher classes, and she's wearing very heavy, very thick woolen clothing. There's not much you can do in such clothing. Riding a horse in such clothing will be difficult. Certainly holding a sword or an axe will not be easy. So we tend to think of women in the Middle Ages as not only the weaker sex, but the sex that was relatively useless for everything except bearing and bringing up children and working, doing lots and lots of work, but usually work under the direction of men. And although, of course, this is one side of the picture, it is not the entire picture. The subject of women in the Middle Ages, the subject of women at any period, is a huge subject. And the status of women in any society, in any age, varies from place to place and from time to time, and very much depends on individual circumstances. Of course, there is a further element of social class. What may be acceptable at one level of society may not be so acceptable at another level of society. And so you cannot talk about the medieval woman. There are just women who lived during the medieval centuries. We can make a number of general points, and the first and most important of these is that women were, in all places and at all times, legally inferior to men. They were under the supervision of their fathers until they reached the age of marriage, after which they were under the supervision of their husbands. Women needed permission to sign contracts, they needed permission to borrow money, they also needed permission to give evidence in court. Indeed, some years ago, this is fairly deep into the 21st century, I was involved in some legal proceedings, which I won't explain in any detail, except to say that I emerged from them the winner. At the end of those proceedings, when we were sitting in front of a judge and the settlement had been agreed, the judge turned to us, or rather the judge turned to me and said, "Can I take it that you will speak on behalf of your wife as well?" And my wife nodded and I nodded, and so we proceeded. And this is the modern age. And certainly back in the 1970s, it was very difficult for a single woman, for an unmarried woman or a woman in her own right, to do something as straightforward as to rent a television set. It was expected that a man would do the talking and that a man would sign the contract of hire. This being the case in the present age, or in the age that has just passed, you can assume that in the Middle Ages, women were in a state of much more solid legal subjection. However, this state of legal subjection only applied to married women or to women who lived in their father's house. If you were a widow, none of these restrictions applied. Women could and did own land, they owned businesses, they ran businesses, they made contracts, they borrowed, they lent money, they took legal action, and they were pretty well autonomous. Women could do all sorts of things that you normally assume only men could. The legal subjection of women mostly applied to married women or women living under their father's roof. It did not, for the most part, apply to women who were independent. If a woman survived childbirth, and that's a very big if because childbirth was extremely dangerous, she could reasonably expect to outlive more than one husband. This meant that there were more widows in the medieval period than there are today. Mostly widows are rather elderly because most people make it into their late 70s or into their 80s. Although women live longer than men, it's not very much longer, 5 years, maybe 10 years, and this is usually right at the end of life when people are not terribly active. But in the medieval period, a woman could reasonably expect to get to the age of 35 and find herself a widow, and then she might marry again, and then in her mid-40s, if she made it that far, she might be a widow again. This meant larger numbers of independent women, legally independent women, and therefore autonomous women. And here is a picture on the right of the Wife of Bath. Has anyone read Chaucer's Wife of Bath's tale? I had to do it for A-level English many years ago. It did put me off Chaucer for many years, but more recently I've come to a better appreciation of him. This is a woman portrayed by Chaucer as bordering on the gross, a rather earthy woman. a rather comical character, but a character whom you are forced to respect. And here we are. For gentlemen, since I was 12 years of age, thanked be God who is eternally alive, I have had 5 husbands at the church door. Of 5 husbands schooling am I. Welcome to the 6th, whenever he shall appear. A slight parody there. It was unusual for a woman to run through 5 husbands, and in the absence of divorce, this meant 5 husbands who come to the church door and then sometime thereafter die. This means being widowed 5 times. It's somewhat unusual, but hardly unique. It is hardly something that is unthinkable. There must have been such women, and there may have been quite large numbers of them, but certainly of women who've outlived one husband and don't marry again, or women who've married 2 husbands and don't marry again. There were considerable numbers. So you have a high degree of practical female autonomy. The law does not accept women as fully autonomous unless they are single women, which means widowed women. But in practice there were large numbers of widowed women, and so there was more scope than we might normally assume for female autonomy in this period. And for women, the Crusades were often just as much the glorious adventure as they were for men, and they were often just as much the glorious adventure in the same way as they were for men. Here, though, I need to move to a digression on health in the Crusader kingdoms. We do know rather more about this than we know about many other things. Now, there is a slide that is entirely superfluous. I put it in for reasons that I can no longer entirely remember. There is a story, and it is a story of very dubious provenance, about a woman pope in the Middle Ages. Some people put her into the 9th century, other people put her into the 11th century. There is no reason, or at least there is no good reason, to suppose that she existed, but the story is that at some time in the Middle Ages, a woman concealed herself as a man, became a papal clerk, and then, because of her talents and her character, worked her way up to the point where she was elected pope. And she continued as the pope for about a year, until in the midst of a papal procession she fell down and gave birth, which was somewhat a surprise for the people watching the procession. One story says that she was torn to pieces by the crowd. Other people say that she was formally put to death. There is, again, no good reason to suppose that Pope Joan existed, but it's an entertaining story, and I'll give you the slide. But let's have a look at women in the Crusades. First, you have women as non-military pilgrims. There is just as good a reason for a woman to visit the holy places in Jerusalem as for a man. Women are sinners as well, women feel the need of absolution, and women are also interested in seeing the world. And so you do have non-military pilgrims, large numbers of them. Then you have women as the wives of knights and other soldiers, and here on the right of the slide you have 4 bullet points giving an almost random selection of those wives of great men who accompanied their husbands on various of the Crusades. The most famous of these, I think, is Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Queen of England, the wife of Henry II, who accompanied her first husband. Yes, she had a rather checkered life, but she accompanied her first husband, Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade. She and Louis spent most of the crusade arguing so bitterly that when he got back to France, he found a way to get rid of her. He managed to get the marriage annulled, and she immediately jumped into bed with young Henry of England and became Queen of England. Richard the Lionheart, he took his newly-wed wife Berengaria and his sister Joanna to the Holy Land with him on the Third Crusade. That doesn't mean very much. Berengaria didn't take a very active part in the Crusades, and one might say that Richard is not normally thought to have been the marrying kind, but he took his wife and his sister on the crusade. Margaret of Provence, she accompanied Louis IX of France on a disastrously failed crusade to Egypt. And then Eleanor of Castile, she was the wife of the future Edward I of England. She accompanied Edward on a crusade to the Holy Land in 1271, shortly before the collapse of the Crusader kingdoms. Indeed, that was not a very successful crusade. Eleanor didn't take much part in that. The main part was taken by Edward, who had the bright idea of allying himself to the Mongols, a no-no as far as the Islamic powers were concerned, and a no-no as far as the native Crusaders, as far as the native Latins, the natives of the Crusader kingdoms were concerned. You can't say that the famous women who accompanied their husbands on the Crusades did anything very positive. Their influence, so far as it existed, was generally negative, but at least they went on crusades, so the wives of knights and other soldiers. Then you have the role of women as ancillaries in the battles. There is a very blurred line, a very blurred borderline between fighting as an ancillary in a battle, that is bringing food and water to men or working as a nurse, and putting on armour and fighting in a battle. Women might begin in a battle by bringing food and water to the men on the battlefield. They might then, depending on how the battle went, feel obliged to take part in the actual fighting. And this is something that I will discuss later on. Then you have women as what are called camp followers, the people who follow behind the army, because an army on the march needs all manner of services. You need cooks, you need traders, you need prostitutes, you need all manner of ancillary services. If you are an army on the march, you have sometimes as many camp followers as you have soldiers, and women were often very prominent among the camp followers. And again, I'll emphasize, not just as prostitutes or providers in various capacities of sexual services, but as traders, as doctors, as nurses, as various kinds of interpreter, if a woman was skilled in the relevant languages. So you do have women, to some degree, integrated into the military life of those kingdoms. The image on this slide is of very limited relevance. It's Byzantine, and it simply shows a dancing girl, but one can say that they also were among the camp followers. The men, once they'd finished the fighting or preparing for it, might feel in need of some relaxation, and watching dancing girls is as good a way to relax as any. Let me, though, come to this question of differential mortality, because it is differential mortality on which the position of women turns in the Middle Ages and in the Crusades. I said that if a woman could survive childbirth, a very big if, she had a much better chance of making it to old age than a man had. And we do have some hard evidence for this. Some various people have examined the lives of the legitimate offspring of English kings, queens, dukes and duchesses born between about 1330 and about 1480, which is somewhat outside our period, but since conditions changed slowly in the Middle Ages, it can be taken as representative of the situation 100 or even 200 years earlier. And it seems that by an examination of the lives of these people, we can say that after the age of 20, a man could expect to live another 21.7 years, but a woman could expect to live another 31.1 years. This is based on a small sample, but it probably is a reasonably representative sample. What that means is that a man in the higher classes might reasonably expect to make it into his 40s, only just. A woman could expect to make it rather more solidly into her 50s. Of course, some people died in their early 20s, other people made it into their 80s and 90s. We're talking about averages. It does suggest that women lived about 10 years longer than men. And the main reason for this difference in life expectancy was violent death. Have a look at this slide on the left. Have a look at this slide on the right. You've got a jousting match. The women are watching. They're in no danger of a violent death. The men are in danger of a violent death, and the man on the left of this image has received some kind of head injury and is falling off his horse. He may fall dead to the ground. It's impossible to say. But this is a fairly good illustration of the different roles of the sexes in the Middle Ages. I will show later on that women could be just as violent and just as effective on the field of battle as men, but men were far more likely to find themselves on the field of battle than women, and therefore they were far more likely to die violent deaths. And then you have general homicide, not just death in battle, but death by violence, murder, casual fights in the street. Men were far more likely to die violent deaths than women were. It seems that in 13th century England, for every 13 male victims of homicide, you have 3 female, and that applies across all classes. And for this reason, women did live longer than men, and therefore women had reasonable hope, perhaps not hope, a reasonable chance of achieving the autonomy that I mentioned earlier. This is the experience of women in Western Europe, and we know a lot more about Western Europe than we know about the Crusader kingdoms, but it's not likely to have been substantially different in the Crusader kingdoms themselves, though probably you will need to move those average life expectancies from the age 20 down a little, because the Crusader kingdoms appear to have been considerably less healthy than Western Europe. This again is something we may find surprising. We do think of the Mediterranean as a wonderfully healthy place. You have those clear blue skies, you have the sun shining down 300 days a year, you have the wine, you have the olive oil, you have the sea, and you think of the Eastern Mediterranean in particular as being a nice, safe place, a nice, healthy place. But that is our modern experience. In the Middle Ages, the further south you went, the less healthy the climate became. There's a great deal of contemporary evidence for this, and it's only what you'd expect. Many years ago, my wife and I found ourselves in a graveyard in Crete, and we wandered around looking at the gravestones, looking at the names and the details of the lives of these people. We also looked at their ages at death, and it was rather interesting to see that almost everybody in that graveyard, going back into the early 20th century, had made it into the 80s and some cases into the late 90s. And from that we inferred that indeed the Mediterranean was a very healthy place to live. But of course that is only the evidence for the 20th century, an age of modern plumbing, and from the middle of the 20th century, an age of antibiotics and of effective medical treatments. If you go further back, the Mediterranean is indeed seen as a very unhealthy place to live. I won't read all of those blue boxes, but Eckhard of Aura, 1106, on the first capture of Jerusalem in 1099. In the heat of summer, the air over Palestine was tainted with the stench of dead bodies. Some maintain that the barbarians, that is the Arabs or the Turks, some maintain that the barbarians had spoiled the springs with poison and the reservoirs with the putrid fluids of the dead, whence there rose a pestilence which killed many of our people who fought under foreign skies. I don't think the smell of dead bodies will bring on an epidemic. There was a belief in the past that infections were brought by an invisible miasma. Yes, that's it. Infections are caused by a miasma, an invisible, undetectable gas, which might become detectable when it began to smell, at which point it became dangerous. But we can imagine that there were any number of bacterial and parasitic infections in the very hot climate of the Near East. Or William of Malmesbury, the Franks were not suited to fighting in the Levant. Those people, softened by the mildness of their own air, were defeated not by battle, but by the heat of battle. So the Eastern Mediterranean was seen as a very unhealthy place. It was a place racked by continual epidemics, and it is epidemics that carried off some of the principal actors in the Crusades. Admar, the papal legate, died of typhus, or the great Saladin, the man who took Jerusalem from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he died of an epidemic some years after his peace with Richard the Lionheart. There was a very ferocious outbreak of typhus around the time of the capture of Jerusalem. It struck the Crusader armies just after the taking of Antioch, and it continued raging until after the taking of Jerusalem itself, and it is in that epidemic that Admar died. So this was not a very healthy region, and we must also bear in mind that you know that if you go to a foreign country, it takes a while to acclimatise. You have the wrong clothes with you, you have the wrong food preferences for the climate, you don't sleep at the right times. It may be appropriate in some parts of the world to have a siesta, rather than try staying awake through the blazing heat of the noonday hours and then try to sleep at night. It took a while for people to adjust themselves to the very new climate of the Levant, and that of course would lead to a great many deaths that would not have happened back home in Western Europe. I looked at some reports a few years ago, some archaeological excavations of toilets in what had been the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the study of toilets is very important. It sounds peripheral, it sounds rather unpleasant to go grubbing round 800-year-old toilets. It's probably not very nice, but you can learn a lot about the people who sat on those toilets by looking at what they have left behind. And it does seem that most of the people using those toilets were suffering from massive infestations of intestinal parasites of all kinds, and this also would have shortened life expectancy in the Crusader kingdoms. Then you have the state of medical science in the Middle Ages, and here is a long and interesting account, again by Usama ibn Munkid, his autobiography. He gives a large number of anecdotes of sometimes rather doubtful provenance, but even though individual stories may be untrue, or even though individual stories may be played with, they probably do represent a certain level of reality. And this particular story is probably biased by a certain prejudice against the level of civilization of the invading Franks. A doctor's tale. They took me to see a knight who had an abscess on his leg and a woman with consumption. I applied a poultice to the leg, and the abscess opened and began to heal. I prescribed a cleansing and refreshing diet for the woman. Then there appeared a Frankish doctor who said, "This man has no idea how to cure these people." He turned to the knight and said, "Which would you prefer, to live with one leg or to die with two?" When the knight replied that he would prefer to live with one leg, he sent for a strong man with a sharp axe. They arrived, and I stood by to watch. The doctor supported the leg on a block of wood and said to the man, "Strike a mighty blow and cut cleanly." And there before my eyes the fellow struck the knight with one blow and then another, for the first had not finished the job. The marrow spurted out of the leg, and the patient died instantaneously. Then the woman examined the woman and said, "She has a devil in her head who is in love with her. Cut her hair off." This was done, and she went back to eating her usual Frankish food, garlic and mustard, which made her illness worse. "The devil has got into her brain," pronounced the doctor. He took a razor and cut a cross on her head and removed the brain so that the inside of the skull was laid bare. This he rubbed with salt. The woman died instantly. At this juncture I asked whether they had any further need of me, and as I had none, I came away, having learned things about medical methods that I never knew before. This may be a true story, it may be a combination of true stories, it may involve a certain level of exaggeration. It certainly pleased the Islamic peoples of this region to think that although they tended to lose wars and battles against these invaders, they were at least of a higher level of civilization. And so this is the kind of story that might be based to some degree on reality, but which was greedily passed from mouth to mouth, growing in details as it went until it reached the writer, who may then have played with it himself, and so it has come down to us. But what we can say is that the medical science in this period, and certainly in Western Europe, was not quite so advanced as we might wish. Some months ago, I visited Alnwick Castle with my wife and daughter, Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, where the Harry Potter films were sometimes filmed. There was a live exhibition of men in medieval costume who are doing medieval things, and I got into a long conversation with a man who was showing medicine in the Middle Ages. He showed me the various instruments, and he went through the various ways that people had of extracting teeth and of dealing with tooth pain. One of the ways involved holding a wax candle inside someone's mouth so that it would burn the nerve and stop the tooth from hurting. And I thought, I'm very glad that I wasn't alive at this time. I'm not happy with my teeth as they are, but at least I have them, and I know that if anything goes wrong, I shall have a nice Novocaine injection before the dentist starts drilling and poking too hard into them. And that was dentistry in the Middle Ages. When you look at the things like the extraction of arrowheads, dealing with fevers, virtually any medical practice, it was all very primitive indeed by our standards, and may often have done a great deal more harm than good to the patient. This plus the alien climate must have cut quite a large swathe through the Latin population of the Near East. And although several 100,000 Christian immigrants turned up in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader kingdoms in the 12th century. It's difficult to say how long these people stayed alive and how efficiently they reproduced themselves. Again, coming back to the differential mortality of men and women. We do know something about women in the Crusader kingdoms, though most of what we know concerns women at the absolute top of society. And here is Queen Melisende of Jerusalem. This is her coronation. She was the daughter of Baldwin II. He died without sons, and he was succeeded by his daughter. She ruled jointly with her husband Fulk of Anjou, who was the grandfather by his first marriage of Henry II of England. It's often surprising how these people were all fairly closely related, and how English royalty had more than a walk-on part in the history of the Crusades, but there it is. The idea was that if a woman became the queen by accident of birth, she was expected to marry and then retire to her quarters and spend her life having children and spinning wool with her maids. Every so often, though, you had a woman who did not resign herself to that fate, and Melisende was one of them. She succeeded in overawing her husband and making sure that she kept control of the administration of the state. Then, when her husband died 12 years after she became the queen, she continued ruling as the effective Queen of Jerusalem, jointly with her son Baldwin III, and she made sure that Baldwin III had no say in the administration of the kingdom. She made sure to fill all the offices of state with her own supporters, and she was very popular with the common people. She was a ruler of great competence, dealing with the Islamic powers, dealing with the revived Byzantine Empire, generally making sure that her kingdom was not invaded and indeed not eroded by partial conquest. William of Tyre, one of the best informed historians of the period, says she was a very wise woman, fully experienced in almost all affairs of state business, who completely triumphed over the handicap of her sex so she could take charge of important affairs. Striving to emulate the glory of the best princes, Melisende ruled the kingdom with such ability that she was rightly considered to have equalled her predecessors in that regard. And Baldwin II and his predecessor Baldwin I were no fools. They were not weak and ineffective kings. For Melisende to be compared favourably with her two great predecessors is very high praise from somebody who was fully qualified to give or to withhold that praise. She was also, I'll just mention casually, half Armenian. Let's move away from the native Latin women of the Near East. Let's look at the women who went on crusade. The first one is Florine of Burgundy. She accompanied her husband, a son of the King of Denmark, on the First Crusade. Remember, the First Crusade was not a very well organised affair. You had this miscellaneous collection of armies turning up under the walls of Constantinople, and they marched through Asia in very loose formation towards Antioch. There was the main body of the army under Raymond of Toulouse, but there were other armies under people like Bohemond, and it's Bohemond who was attacked at the Battle of Dorylaeum by the Turks, and it's only the arrival several hours later of the main body of the army that turned a tactical defeat into a major strategic victory. Well, one of the more spread out parts of this army was the group of 1,500 horsemen led by Florine and her husband. Sadly for them, they were taken by surprise as they were advancing across the plains of what is now central Turkey. They were attacked by the Turks, they're outnumbered, but they defended themselves with great courage and persistence for an entire day, but they were unable to drive off the Turks. And the story is that Florine fought valiantly beside her husband. Here is a 19th century representation of this, which is not terribly realistic. I don't think a woman would easily be able to hold an iron broadsword quite like that, and she certainly wouldn't have been wearing any kind of court costume. But this is a representation of Florine fighting off the Turks. And they continued fighting to the very end. She was, according to the chroniclers, pierced by 7 arrows but still fighting. She was trying to fight her way through the Turks so that she could clear an escape route into the mountains. But she and her husband were overwhelmed by the Turks, and they fell together on the field of battle at Philomelium. They were the last to die, having seen all their knights and most faithful servants perish around them. So there is a woman in the Crusades. Her contribution was to fight and die, but many people died, but there is no reasonable doubt that she went down fighting and died with a sword in her hand, which is somewhat surprising when you think of the conventional view of women in the Middle Ages as being rather small and light and committed to the more peaceful pursuits of life. Then we have another female warrior, Ida of Austria. She was, you can't call her the Queen of Austria, you certainly can't call her the Empress of Austria, but she was one of the ancestors of the Habsburg monarchs. In 1101, she joined one of the subsidiary crusades, because the first crusade, that was the big one, in which Antioch and Jerusalem were taken, but there were continuing smaller crusades after, where bands of armed men would ride off from Western Europe, past Constantinople, down to the Kingdom of Jerusalem to reinforce the existing armies there and to take part in the fighting. Well, Ida of Austria joined the Crusade of 1101, and she raised and led her own army. She didn't go with her husband. She went as the formal head of her own army towards Jerusalem. Unfortunately for her, in September 1101, she and her army were ambushed quite a long distance from Jerusalem. There are two stories. One is that she went down in the fighting. She died with a sword in her hand. There is an alternative story according to which she was captured and she lived out the rest of her life in a Turkish harem. We don't know what the truth is, but there is reasonable ground for believing that either she was killed or she was taken with a sword in her hand. Again, a woman taking up the sword and killing men. Then you have a woman who never made it to the Holy Land, but who is associated with the history of the Crusader kingdoms. She was the second wife of Robert Guiscard, who was the father of Bohemond, the first prince of Antioch. She never went on a crusade, but she was part of the Norman army that turned up in the western provinces of Greece in the Byzantine Empire. We have Anna Komnena on her. She's talking about a counterattack by the imperial forces against the Normans. These, however, resisted the attack very stoutly, so the others turned their backs, threw themselves into the sea, and up to their necks in water made their way to the Roman and Venetian ships and begged them for protection, which they did not receive. And now, as rumour relates, directly Gaita, that's what Anna calls her, Gaita, Robert's wife, who was riding at his side and was a second Pallas, if not an Athena, saw these soldiers running away. She looked after them fiercely, and in a very powerful voice called out to them in her own language, an equivalent to Homer's words, "How far will ye flee? Stand and quit you like men." And when she saw they continued to run, she grasped a long spear, and at full gallop rushed after the fugitives, and on seeing this they recovered themselves and returned to the fight. Here on the right is a representation of a woman fighting, sword in hand. Again, iron swords were very, very heavy, and a woman of this kind doesn't look very capable of holding, let alone using a sword in battle. Also, you can reasonably doubt that she would have been wearing clothes like this with what looks like a corset about her waist. But the image is a representation in some degree of the reality. Women would take up swords, they would take up weapons in general, and they would join in the fighting. Not very often, not on a regular basis, but it was done sufficiently often not to be a total shock to observers. Emma of Hauteville, again not in the Holy Land, but connected tangentially to the Crusades. She was not an actual fighter. She didn't take part in the fighting, but she supervised the defence of her city, and she did so very effectively. But since she was not directly involved, and not even very closely involved at the tangent, I won't say much more about her. I'll leave you to look at the slide for yourself. But here we do have a woman who was involved in the fighting, and she was an English woman, though born in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. She was born, I believe, to English pilgrims to the Holy Land. She lived there in her early days, and then she went back to the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a pilgrim, where she found herself mixed up in Saladin's great siege of Jerusalem. Here is an account dictated to her younger brother and transmitted in various rather vague ways to us. During this siege, which lasted 15 days, I carried out all the functions of a soldier that I could. I wore a breastplate like a man. I came and went on the ramparts with a cauldron on my head for a helmet. Though a woman, I seemed a warrior. I threw the weapon. Though filled with fear, I learned to conceal my weakness. It was hot, and the fighters could have no rest. I was giving the soldiers at the wall water to drink, when a stone like a mill wheel fell near me. I was hit by one of its fragments. My blood ran, but my wound quickly healed, because someone immediately brought medicine, though the scar remains. Your feast day, O St. Michael, came and went sadly without song. What could we offer in your honour when we were so filled with fear? An unlucky treaty took me in the holy places into the hands of the enemy. I was taken prisoner, but on paying some guineas I was set free. I joined a group of others likewise redeemed. She then had a long series of adventures in the Holy Land before making it back to England and dictating her life story to her younger brother, who wrote it up. As I said, it's been transmitted to us in a somewhat vague way, so far as the original manuscript has disappeared, and we need to rely on fairly recent copies of this. But there you have an admission by a woman, in her own words, that she put on armour and fought on the walls of Jerusalem to repel the enemy. And since the siege of Jerusalem, the second siege of Jerusalem, was a desperate affair, it's quite reasonable that the shortage of men should be supplied by the women. If there are not enough men to stand on the walls holding off the enemy, then women need to take part. If women don't take part, the city will fall. Therefore, although if a woman were to try enlisting in normal circumstances, or were to put on armour and announce, "I will fight also," she might have been laughed at, she might have been politely steered out of the room. In the desperate conditions of the second siege of Jerusalem, nobody cared about the sex of whoever was fighting beside him. The important thing was to have enough pairs of hands on the walls to repel the attackers, and Margaret of Beverley found herself among the defenders at the siege of Jerusalem. She became a prisoner of war, she managed to redeem herself, she got out, she had further adventures, and then she came back to England, and after that time we lose track of her. But there is an eyewitness account, a personal confession of a woman who fought in the Crusades. And this brings me to the wider issue about which we don't know nearly as much as we would like. Let me read these accounts to you, because it's better to read what people at the time said than to try summarising them. This is Imad al-Din, an Arab chronicler of the late 12th century. Among the Franks there were indeed women who rode into battle with cuirasses and helmets, dressed in men's clothes, who rode out into the thick of the fray and acted like brave men, although they were but tender women, maintaining that all this was an act of piety, thinking to gain heavenly rewards by it, and making it their way of life. Praise be to him who led them into such error and out of the paths of wisdom. On the day of battle, more than one woman rode out with them like a knight, and showed masculine endurance in spite of the weakness of her sex. Clothed only in a coat of mail, they were not recognized as women until they had been stripped of their arms. I think we can take that as pretty certain evidence that women fought in the regular armies among the Franks. William of Tyre, again writing about the second siege of Jerusalem, even women, regardless of sex and natural weakness, dared to assume arms and fought manfully far beyond their strength. Or William of Tyre again, women cheered the fighters to renewed courage by their words, and brought them water in small vessels, that they might not faint on the field of battle. Now, there you don't have women fighting, but you have women pretty well integrated into the battle effort. Or Imad al-Din again. There was a woman on one of the points of the defence, holding a bow of wood, firing well and drawing blood. She did not stop fighting until she was killed. Or someone called Bah al-Din on the siege of Acre in 1191. One very intelligent old man was amongst those who forced their way into the enemy's trenches that day. Behind their rampart, he told me, was a woman wrapped in a green meluta, a kind of mantle, who kept on shooting arrows from a wooden bow, with which she wounded several of our men. She was at last overpowered by numbers. We killed her and brought the bow she had been using to the Sultan, that is to Saladin, who was greatly astonished. So there you have it. Women were fully integrated at times into the war effort of the Crusader kingdoms. By that, I'm not saying that women had the same role in the Frankish or the Latin armies as women have in the modern Israeli army. There was no regular recruitment of women into the armies, but this was a kingdom which was always on the margin. It was always one or two battles from total annihilation. There were never enough fighting men in the Kingdom of Jerusalem or in the other Crusader states. Mostly these states were at peace with their neighbours in practice, if not in theory, and so there was no need for women to put on armour and to take part in the fighting. But as I said, these were marginal kingdoms, marginal states. They were always on the edge of obliteration, and when the situation became desperate, as it did fairly regularly, then it was accepted that women should supply the deficiency of fighting men. Women should take part in the fighting, sometimes by shooting arrows at the besieging Islamic armies, sometimes, perhaps more rarely, by putting on armour, taking up the sword, and rushing out into the battle to take part in the fighting. And although this happened more often in the Crusader kingdoms than in Western Europe, there is a great deal of evidence from Western Europe that women did indeed there take part in the fighting when the battle went against an army and when there was a shortage of men. It was not unthinkable for a woman to take up the sword. So, coming back to where I started, the Crusades were a glorious adventure for the men who went out and fought. It was a glorious adventure because it got them from rather dumpy Western Europe into the more glamorous climes of the Levant. They got to kill large numbers of people with the full approval of the religious authorities. There was also the possibility, if they survived the fighting, that they might acquire estates and considerable wealth from their efforts. And it was not only men who went on crusade, it was not only men who fought in those battles, it was also women. And I'll repeat, it seems to have been the case, without having any definite figures to show this, but it does seem to have been the case that women fought more often in the wars of the Crusader kingdoms than in the wars of the various European powers. So that's what I have to say about women in the Crusades. I haven't said much, but there isn't very much to say about it. Are there any questions?